Eleanor Voss had walked past that door every single day of her 38-year marriage and never once been allowed to open it. Tucked at the end of the upstairs hallway of her Tennessee farmhouse, always locked, always silent. It had been Raymond's, his secret, his promise, his mystery. He'd been gone for 14 months. And 3 days ago, while cleaning out the bottom drawer of his old oak dresser, her fingers had closed around a small brass key with a handwritten note folded carefully beneath it. Open it when you have nothing left to lose. What Eleanor found behind that door didn't just change her life. It brought her completely to her knees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Stories like Eleanor's remind us that the people who love us most often work in silence. That the greatest gifts are never wrapped in ribbons, but hidden in plain sight, behind locked doors and patient years, waiting for precisely the right moment to reveal themselves. If you believe in love that outlasts death, in sacrifice that speaks from beyond the grave, and in the kind of hope that arrives just when you are certain it never will, stay with us. Because what Raymond Voss spent the better part of his life building for his wife will prove, beyond any doubt, that real love doesn't end at the grave. It keeps working. It keeps protecting. It keeps whispering, "I've got you," long after the voice that said it has gone quiet. Eleanor Grace Voss was 66 years old, a widow for 14 months and 3 days, and she had exactly 22 days left before she would lose the only home she had ever truly known. The farmhouse sat on 44 acres of gently rolling land just outside of Clover Ridge, Tennessee, a small town about an hour east of Nashville, where everybody knew your name and most of them knew your business too. It was a white clapboard house with a wide wraparound porch, a weather vane shaped like a rooster that hadn't spun freely in 15 years, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of biscuits and strong black coffee. Eleanor and Raymond had moved here as newlyweds, young and broke and completely in love, with nothing but a second-hand truck, a box of tools, and the particular brand of stubbornness that only two people who have chosen each other against all practical advice can carry. They had built the life here, slowly and with great effort. The house repaired season by season, the land worked, the debts paid down, and then, in harder years, quietly accumulated again. Raymond had been a carpenter by trade and a thinker by nature, the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands and who spent long evenings reading in silence, occasionally looking up to say something so precise and true that Eleanor would stop whatever she was doing and look at him. He had built half the furniture in the house himself. He had rebuilt the porch twice. He had loved this land with the same quiet constancy with which he had loved his wife. And then, 4 years before he died, Raymond had gotten sick. The diagnosis was a degenerative heart condition, serious from the start, the doctors said, though manageable with the right treatment. The right treatment was expensive. They had managed for a while, drawing on savings they had spent decades building, then on a second mortgage, then on a small loan Raymond had taken against the business he'd operated for 30 years. Eleanor had known things were tight. She had not known the full extent of how tight until after the funeral, when she sat down with the papers Raymond had always kept neatly filed in the bottom drawer of his desk and understood, for the first time, what they were truly carrying. The total debt was $163,000. Medical bills, the second mortgage, the business loan. Raymond had managed all of their finances, always had, always with her trust, and he had been protecting her from the full weight of the numbers, even as he worked to chip away at them. Eleanor had read those papers with dry eyes, because she'd already used up most of her tears in the 2 weeks since she'd found him in his recliner on a Tuesday morning in October. Already gone, the old quilt pulled up to his chest like he'd simply fallen asleep watching the light change in the yard. The bank had sent the first letter 11 days after the funeral, then a second, then a phone call from Craig Whitmore, the regional director of Clover Ridge Savings and Trust, a man with a measured voice and the careful politeness of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that he had refined it into something almost gentle. "Mrs. Voss, we completely understand what you're going through. We simply need to find a path forward together." That conversation had been over a year ago. In the months since, Eleanor had sold Raymond's truck, his table saw, his planer, his workshop trailer, and the riding mower he had babied for 12 years. She had taken in alterations and mending work from women around town. She had kept the heat low and the grocery list short and sent every dollar she could spare to the bank. It had not been enough. The interest compounded. The principal held stubbornly in place. And 3 weeks ago, Craig Whitmore had driven out to the farmhouse himself, parked his silver sedan in the gravel driveway, and handed Eleanor a certified envelope while she stood on the porch she'd swept that morning in the November cold. Final notice: 30 days to resolve the full outstanding balance or begin formal vacating proceedings. Eleanor had stood there holding that envelope until his car disappeared down the road. Then she had gone inside, sat at the kitchen table Raymond had built with his own hands, and stared at the grain of the wood for a very long time. She was 66 years old. She had no children, 2 pregnancies lost early in the marriage, a grief they had carried together and eventually made peace with, choosing a life that was fully, completely the two of them. She had no living siblings. She had her neighbor Donna Callahan next door, her church on Sunday mornings, and this house. That was the whole of her world. And in 22 days, the house would be taken from her. It was on the 8th day after the final notice, while forcing herself, finally, to go through Raymond's dresser, a task she had been quietly avoiding for 14 months, that Eleanor's hand touched something cold and small at the very back of the bottom drawer, beneath a folded flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of him. A brass key, and a note in Raymond's handwriting. Eleanor sat on the edge of Raymond's side of the bed. She still thought of it as his side, still slept only on hers, and stared at the key resting in her open palm. It was small, old-fashioned, the kind that belonged to interior doors rather than padlocks. Brass, slightly tarnished, with a simple rounded bow at the top and a single clean tooth at the bottom. She had never seen it before in her life. Not once in 38 years of sharing this house, this dresser, this life. She unfolded the note beneath it. Raymond's handwriting, neat, slanting slightly to the right, the same hand that had written her birthday cards for nearly 4 decades, that had left her notes on the kitchen counter reading coffees fresh or backed by supper, covered a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I left before I could explain things the way I always meant to. I'm sorry I wasn't there to hold your hand through whatever came after. But I need you to do something for me. You know the door at the end of the hall. The one I always kept locked. The one I told you was just storage, just odds and ends I hadn't sorted through yet. I wasn't entirely honest with you about that, sweetheart. Not to deceive you. Never to deceive you. I kept that door locked because what was behind it wasn't finished. And because I needed it to be right before you ever saw it. I've been working on something since before we were married. Since I was 24 years old and already knew, somehow, that you were going to be the person I spent the rest of my life trying to take care of. It took a long time. It took everything I had in small amounts stretched across many years. But I finished it. Open the door when you need it most. When the world feels like it has run out of room for you. That is when it will mean everything I always meant it to mean. I love you more than I ever quite managed to say. And I said a great deal. Forever yours, Raymond. Eleanor read the letter 4 times without moving from the edge of the bed. The flannel shirt was still in her other hand, pressed against her knee. The afternoon light had shifted while she sat there, going thin and golden through the curtains Raymond had never liked but never complained about, and somewhere outside a cardinal was calling from the old oak tree in the yard. The same oak that Raymond had threatened to cut down every single autumn because of the leaves it dropped across the full length of the porch, and that Eleanor had talked him out of removing every single time. She pressed the note carefully against her chest and closed her eyes. Raymond Voss had been, above everything else, a man who kept his word. In 38 years, she had watched him do exactly what he said he would do, consistently, without fanfare or exception. He had promised her a home and built one with his hands. He had promised her a steady life and worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide it. He had promised her, on the night they lost their second pregnancy, sitting together in the hospital parking lot while rain came down on the windshield, that he would not leave her alone in the hard parts. She had believed him then. She believed him still, holding this key in the dim November light, 14 months after the morning she had found him gone. She had met Raymond when she was 27 at a church social in Clover Ridge. He had been standing at the edge of the fellowship hall, looking mildly uncomfortable in a pressed button-down shirt, holding a paper plate with a slice of lemon cake he clearly had no intention of eating. When Eleanor walked over and said, "You look like a man who would rather be somewhere else entirely," he had looked at her with those quiet gray eyes and said, without missing a beat, "I would, but I'm beginning to think that might change." She had laughed, surprised by it. He had smiled, slow and certain. That, as Eleanor always told the story afterward, had been the whole of how it started. They had been matched from that first evening. Raymond was methodical, where Eleanor ran on instinct. He was quiet, where she was expressive, patient in a way that had occasionally frustrated her and far more often anchored them both. He thought before he spoke. He measured twice before he cut once. He had a way of going completely still when a problem sat in front of him. Not in defeat, but in deep calculation, as if he were already 3 moves ahead of where the rest of the world was standing. He had always been that way. It was, Eleanor understood now, with sudden and overwhelming clarity, precisely how he had approached this. The locked door had been a fixture of her life in this house for so long that she had long since stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a piece of furniture that has always occupied the same corner. Raymond had mentioned it occasionally over the years. Just old materials from projects, nothing worth digging through. And Eleanor, who had her own corners of the house she considered entirely hers, had accepted that without question. She trusted him. She always had. In 38 years of mornings and evenings and difficult seasons and ordinary Tuesdays, he had given her no reason to do otherwise. She stood slowly, her knees aching the way they always did in the cold months, and walked out of the bedroom and down the hall toward the door that had waited, locked and patient, for longer than she had known to wonder about it. The hallway felt longer than usual, or perhaps Eleanor was simply moving more slowly than she realized. Her hand trailed along the wall as she walked, fingertips brushing the faded wallpaper with its pattern of small cream-colored flowers that she had chosen herself this summer they'd moved in and never quite gotten around to replacing. Raymond had offered to strip it and repaint more times than she could count. She had always said, maybe next year. Now she was grateful she hadn't changed a single inch of it. The door was at the very end of the hall, just past the linen closet, set slightly deeper into the wall than the other doors, as if it had always known it was keeping a different kind of secret. It was a plain door, 6-panel, painted the same off-white as everything else in the hall, with a brass handle that matched the key in Eleanor's palm so precisely that she understood, looking at them together for the first time, that Raymond had installed this lock himself, had chosen it deliberately, had planned this moment in some quiet and methodical corner of his mind for a very long time. She stood in front of it for a moment with her hand at her side. She thought about Raymond at 24, which was how old he said in his note that he had been when he started whatever was behind this door. She had not known Raymond at 24. She had not met him until they were both in their late 20s, which meant that whatever this was had existed before her, had begun before she was even part of his life, and had continued quietly alongside their entire marriage without her knowing. 42 years of a secret kept not out of deception, but out of love. Out of a kind of love so patient and so long-sighted that Eleanor could not fully hold the shape of it in her mind. She inserted the key. The lock turned with a single clean click, smooth and immediate, as if it had been waiting for exactly this. Eleanor pushed the door open. The smell reached her before her eyes fully adjusted. Wood. Rich, warm, complex. Not the raw smell of lumber or sawdust, but the deep, settled fragrance of wood that had been worked and finished and polished and allowed to age in a closed space over many years. It was the smell of Raymond's workshop concentrated and distilled, and it hit her so squarely in the chest that she had to grip the door frame with her free hand. Then she saw the room. It was larger than she had imagined. The hallway always made her think of it as a small space, an afterthought. But Raymond had, at some point she could not determine, taken out the wall between the original room and the narrow storage space beside it to create something nearly double the size she had expected. The ceiling had been raised. Two skylights had been installed above. She had never noticed them from outside, had never thought to wonder about them. And now, in the late afternoon, they threw long panels of pale November light down into the space below. And in that light, arranged on purpose-built shelves and standing platforms, and along every wall, was the most astonishing collection of handcrafted objects Eleanor had ever seen. Furniture, art, sculpture, all made from wood. Not the practical, sturdy furniture Raymond built for their home and for clients around the county. These are something else entirely. A rocking chair so finely shaped and inlaid with contrasting wood grain and geometric patterns that it looked less like furniture and more like something that should be enclosed in glass. A side table with legs tapered to near impossibility, its surface covered in an intricate marquetry landscape. Rolling hills, a tree line, a farmhouse nearly identical to their own, rendered entirely in different shades and grains of wood, fitted together with a precision that made Eleanor lean close and blink, certain for a moment that she was looking at a painting. A tall cabinet with carved panel doors depicting what she recognized with a sharp intake of breath, as scenes from their life together. The church where they had been married. The kitchen garden she had kept for 30 years. The old oak in the yard with its crown of late summer leaves. Raymond standing at a workbench she had never seen with his back to the viewer, but unmistakably, entirely himself. There were dozens of pieces, perhaps 40, perhaps more, each one finished to a standard that even Eleanor, who knew very little about fine craft, understood was extraordinary. Each one labeled on a small tag tied to its base in Raymond's careful handwriting, with a name and a date. The dates ranged from 1981 to just 2 months before he died. On the workbench at the center of the room sat a single wooden box, plain and undecorated, with her name carved into the lid. Eleanor walked toward it on legs that were no longer entirely steady, and inside were a thick folder of documents and a letter written in Raymond's hand. She sank to the floor of that room and wept. She did not know how long she stayed on the floor. Long enough for the light through the skylights to shift from pale gold to the flat gray of early evening. Long enough for her knees to ache and her back to stiffen and for the cold of the hardwood to seep through her cardigan. She sat with Raymond's letter in both hands and read it 3 times before she trusted herself to move on to the documents in the folder beneath it. The letter first. My Eleanor, you found it. I knew you would when the time was right, when you needed it enough. I have been waiting a long time to show you this room. Longer than you know. I started making the first piece, the rocking chair by the south wall, the one with the inlay, in 1981, the year before we met. I was 24 years old and working alone in a rented room in Nashville, teaching myself joinery from library books and making mistakes on cheap pine until I started getting things right. I always knew I could build things. I did not know for a long time that what I was really building was a future. When I met you, I did not tell you about the work. I was not sure why at first. Later I understood. I was afraid that if I told you, it would become something practical, something we would discuss and evaluate and perhaps decide to do differently. I needed to stay mine for a while. My project. My long, quiet project. Every piece in that room represents hours I told you I was working late or running errands or finishing a client job. I was here. I was always here in this room working on these. Eleanor, I need you to open the folder now. The first document on top explains what you have. I spent a great deal of time making sure I documented everything correctly because I wanted you to be protected. I did not want anyone to be able to tell you these things were worth less than they are. The second and third documents are appraisal records. Read them carefully. Then read my instructions at the bottom of the folder before you do anything else. I love you. I always loved you. Every hour I spent in this room, I was thinking of you, making sure you would be okay, making sure that if I left before I was ready to, which I always feared I might, you would not be alone in the hard parts. Not really, not completely. I will be here in every piece of wood in this room, in every joint and every finished edge and every hour I put into making these things worthy of you. You were always worthy of the best I had. Forever and entirely yours. Raymond. Eleanor pressed the letter against her chest for a long moment, then reached into the box for the folder. The first document was a single typed page, clearly prepared by Raymond himself on the old desktop computer he kept in the study. It was titled simply What This Collection Is. He had written it in plain language, the way he did everything, without unnecessary decoration. The pieces in this room are original handcrafted furniture and decorative art, made by me, Raymond Voss, between 1981 and 2023. The collection includes 44 completed works in hardwood, including American black walnut, cherry, white oak, and figured maple. All pieces are fully finished and signed on the underside. All materials and construction methods are documented in the binders on the lower shelf. The collection was built intentionally as a financial asset to be sold in the event of my death or our financial hardship. Eleanor turned to the second document. It was a formal appraisal letter dated 8 months before Raymond died, on a letterhead of a firm called Whitfield Finecraft Appraisers out of Nashville. She read the summary paragraph at the top 3 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. Based on our examination of 38 completed works submitted for appraisal in August 2022 and our assessment of comparable sales at major craft auction houses and private galleries over the preceding 5 years, we estimate the total retail value of the examined collection at between $890,000 and $1,240,000. Individual pieces range in estimated value from $12,000 to $95,000. The rocking chair, designated RC 1981, is the standout piece of the collection and is likely to achieve the highest individual sale price. Eleanor sat very still in the growing dark of the room and read the numbers again. Nearly $1 million, possibly more, in a room she had walked past every day for decades. Behind a door she had never opened. She turned to the third document, which was a second appraisal from a different firm, conducted 6 months after the first, confirming the estimates with only minor variation. Raymond had gotten a second opinion. Of course he had. He had always measured twice. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten page of instructions titled simply, What to Do Next. Eleanor pulled it out with trembling hands and began to read. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Raymond's instructions were written in the same plain, methodical hand as everything else he had ever put on paper, and they were thorough in the way that everything Raymond did was thorough. He had not left her a vague directive to figure it out or a general encouragement to trust her instincts. He had left her a plan. 7 numbered steps, written clearly, with names and contact information included where relevant. 1. Do not tell anyone about this collection until you have spoken with a qualified appraiser or dealer who specializes in American studio craft. Not a neighbor, not a friend, not anyone from the bank. People will want to tell you what things are worth before they know, and they will almost always tell you less than the truth. 2. The name at the top of the contact sheet is Marcus Callahan. He is Donna's boy, your neighbor's son. He works in fine craft sales in Nashville now. I have known for years that he does this work, and I always thought, when the time came, he would be the right person to call first. He is trustworthy. He knows this world. Tell him I sent you. 3. Do not sell anything quickly. I know that may be difficult if the financial situation is what I fear it might be. But these pieces are worth what they are worth only if you take the time to sell them correctly. A rush sale will get you a fraction of their value. A proper sale, through the right channels, will get you everything. 4. The rocking chair is the most valuable single piece. Do not sell it first. Save it for last, as the centerpiece of whatever sale or auction you arrange. It will bring the highest price, and it will draw the most attention to the rest of the collection. 5. There's a second folder in the wooden box beneath this one. It contains records of every piece of what I purchased, every tool I used, every technique I applied. The documentation is complete. This is important. Provenance matters in this world. The paperwork protects you. 6. The second and third documents in this folder are appraisals from 2 separate firms in Nashville. They are real, they are current, and they were expensive to obtain. I got them so that no one could argue with you about value. If anyone tells you these things are worth less than the appraisals say, they're either wrong or lying. Either way, walk away. 7. I love you, Eleanor Grace. Every hour in that room was for you. Now go live. Eleanor sat with the instructions in her lap and allowed herself, for just a few minutes, to be completely overwhelmed. Then she folded the page carefully, placed it back in a wooden box, and stood up. She needed to see the room properly. She needed to understand what Raymond had actually left her. She crossed to the workbench and found Raymond's work lamp right where she expected it to be, the same battered silver lamp he had used in his downstairs workshop for 20 years. She switched it on. Warm light flooded the space, and the collection came into full clarity for the first time. She started with the rocking chair. It was positioned on a low platform in the corner closest to the south skylight, turned at a slight angle as if Raymond had placed it precisely to catch the best light. Eleanor crouched in front of it and looked at the inlay work along the seat back and the arms. The pattern was geometric, diamonds and chevrons and long diagonal lines, rendered in alternating strips of dark walnut and pale maple fitted together so precisely that she could not find a single seam with her fingernail. The wood had been finished to a depth that made it look almost liquid. She had never seen anything like it outside of a museum. She moved through the room slowly after that, stopping at each piece. The marquetry table with their farmhouse rendered in wood. A pair of tall candlesticks turned on a lathe to dimensions so exact they were nearly architectural. A wall panel, long and horizontal, depicting a river valley she did not recognize but that Raymond had somehow made feel entirely familiar. A jewelry box, small and perfect, with her initials inlaid into the lid in a script so elegant it looked like calligraphy. On the underside of each piece, just as Raymond's instructions had said, was his signature and the year of completion. On many of them, there was also a short phrase. She flipped over a small side table dated 1993 and read, in letters no larger than a thumbnail, "For the woman who still laughs at my worst jokes." On the back of a carved panel from 2005, every hour of this was easy because it was for you. Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed slowly. 42 years. 42 years of Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings and stolen hours. Of Raymond saying, "I'm just finishing something up and climbing these stairs and closing this door and building, piece by careful piece, the thing he believed would save her." She walked back to the rocking chair and sat down in it for the first time. It fit her perfectly. She understood immediately, without needing to be told, that Raymond had built it that way on purpose. Eleanor slept better that night than she had in 14 months. Not deeply, not without interruption, but with something underneath the sleep that had been absent for a long time. A floor, a sense that the ground beneath her had shifted from loose sand to something solid, and that when morning came there would be something to stand on. She was at the kitchen table by 6 with Raymond's folder open beside her coffee cup, reading through the documentation binders she had carried downstairs from the room. Raymond had cataloged everything with the same precision he brought to every project he had ever undertaken. Each piece had its own section: materials sourced, dates of construction, techniques used, finishing products applied. Every receipt was taped to its corresponding page. Every photograph, and there were hundreds of them, was labeled and dated. The collection had been built with the care of someone who understood that its value lived as much in the paperwork as in the wood itself. At 8 o'clock, Eleanor called Donna Callahan. Donna had been her closest neighbor for 22 years, a practical and warm-hearted woman who had brought Eleanor a casserole every week for the first 3 months after Raymond died and had never once made her feel like a project. She picked up on the second ring. "Donna," Eleanor said, "your son Marcus. What exactly does he do in Nashville?" There was a brief pause. "Fine craft and decorative art sales," Donna said. "He works with galleries and auction houses mostly." "Why? Is everything all right?" "I think so," Eleanor said carefully. "I think things might actually be all right. Could you ask him to call me today?" Marcus Callahan called 40 minutes later. He was in his late 30s. Eleanor knew, though she hadn't seen him since a Christmas visit 2 years prior. His voice was calm and professional, with just enough of his mother's warmth underneath it to make Eleanor trust him immediately. She told him what she had found. Not everything, not yet, but enough. a collection of handcrafted furniture and wood art made by Raymond over 4 decades. 2 professional appraisals. 44 pieces. Marcus was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "has anyone else seen this collection?" "No. You're the first person I've told." "Good. Keep it that way for now. I can drive up this weekend." "Would Saturday work?" "Saturday would be fine," Eleanor said. She spent the rest of the week going back to the room each day, spending an hour or two reading Raymond's documentation and simply being in the space with his work. She had begun to understand it not just as a financial asset, which it was, but as a record of a person. A 42-year record of what Raymond Voss had spent his best hours on and why. Every piece in that room was a sentence in a love letter too large to fold and put in an envelope. It was on Thursday that Craig Whitmore's car appeared in the driveway again. Eleanor watched it through the kitchen window for a moment before going to the door. Whitmore stepped out of the silver sedan in his usual pressed clothing and started up the porch steps with the careful smile he always wore, the one that was designed to look like reassurance and felt up close like something else entirely. He was not alone. A second car had pulled in behind his, a dark blue SUV with Tennessee plates. The man who climbed out of it was heavy-set, late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of deliberate posture that people adopt when they want to appear larger than they feel. He wore a sport coat and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he came for. "Mrs. Voss," Whitmore said pleasantly when Eleanor opened the door. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. This is Gareth Pullman. He's a private collector based out of Memphis with a particular interest in antiques and handcrafted pieces. I happened to mention your situation, and he expressed an interest in having a conversation." Eleanor kept her hand on the door frame. "I wasn't aware that my situation was something you discussed with private collectors," she said. Whitmore's smile remained perfectly in place. "I'm just trying to help you find options, Martha. You have 19 days left. Options are what you need right now. My name is Eleanor," she said quietly. She had told him this before. "Of course. I apologize." Gareth simply wanted to introduce himself. No pressure whatsoever. Gareth Pullman stepped forward with the smooth ease of someone who had done this many times. "Mrs. Voss, I understand your husband left some craftwork behind. I'd love to take a look, purely informal, no obligation. I buy pieces from estates regularly, and I pay fairly. It might save you a significant amount of time and trouble." Eleanor looked at them both for a moment. "You can come in for 10 minutes, she said. "But I want to be clear about something before you do. I know exactly what I have, and I know exactly what it's worth." Whitmore's smile flickered almost imperceptibly, just for a fraction of a second. Then it was back. "Of course you do," he said pleasantly. "Of course you do." Eleanor led them upstairs without speaking. She had decided, during the 40 seconds it took to walk from the front door to the staircase, exactly how she was going to handle this. She would let Gareth Pullman see the room. She would watch his face when he did. And she would say very little, because Raymond's instructions had been clear on this point. She already knew what the collection was worth, and any number that came out of this man's mouth would be a test she already had the answer key to. She opened the door and stepped aside. Pullman walked in first. Whitmore followed. Eleanor stood in the doorway with her arms loosely crossed and watched them both. Pullman stopped in the center of the room, the way people stop when something genuinely surprises them. Not dramatically, but completely, a full pause and forward motion while the eyes do rapid, recalculating work. He turned slowly, taking in the shelves, the platforms, the finished surfaces catching the afternoon light through the skylights. He crouched briefly in front of the marquetry table. He stood for a longer moment in front of the rocking chair. His expression stayed carefully neutral, but his eyes, Eleanor noticed, were doing something else entirely. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Whitmore stood slightly behind him, saying nothing, which Eleanor noted was a departure from his usual practice commentary. After several minutes, Pullman straightened and turned to Eleanor with a measured smile. "Mrs. Voss, this is genuinely lovely work. Your husband was clearly a dedicated hobbyist. I can see he put real time into these pieces." "Hobbyist," Eleanor said. "Self-taught craftsmen often produce very charming work." Pullman continued smoothly. "The market for this kind of thing is modest but real. Estate pieces like these typically move through local auction for anywhere between $2,000 and $5,000 per item, depending on condition and buyer interest. Given your timeline, I'd be willing to take the full collection off your hands today. I could offer you $80,000 cash for everything in this room. Eleanor looked at him steadily. $80,000, she said. That's a strong offer for work at this level. You'd walk away clean today, no further complications. Eleanor reached into the folder she had carried upstairs and produced the first appraisal letter from Whitfield Finecraft Appraisers. She held it out to him without comment. Pullman took it. "Read it." His jaw shifted slightly, the only movement in an otherwise composed face. "These appraisals can be misleading," he said after a moment. "Estimated values and actual sale prices are very different things." Eleanor held out the second appraisal from the second firm. There was a silence in the room that was, Eleanor felt, almost satisfying. "I'd like you both to leave now," she said. "Please don't come back to this property without contacting me in advance in writing. If you arrive unannounced again, I will be speaking with an attorney." Whitmore opened his mouth. In writing, Eleanor repeated calmly, "Good afternoon." They left. Eleanor stood at the upstairs window and watched both cars back out of the driveway and disappear down the road. Then she went downstairs and wrote in the notebook she had started keeping on the kitchen counter. 2 entries. Gareth Pullman, Memphis, offered $80,000 for full collection, declined. Craig Whitmore, Clover Ridge Savings and Trust, present at unsolicited visit, third occurrence. Marcus Callahan arrived Saturday morning in a practical gray hatchback with a camera bag over one shoulder and his mother's direct, unhurried manner. He was tall with close-cut hair, the kind of careful attention in his eyes that Eleanor associated with people who had spent years learning to really look at things. He spent 4 hours in the room. He photographed every piece from multiple angles, examined joints and finishes with a small magnifying loupe, read through Raymond's documentation binders with focused concentration, and said very little throughout except occasional quiet observations that were clearly directed at himself rather than at Eleanor. At one point, he spent nearly 20 minutes with the rocking chair alone, running his fingertips along the inlay work with an expression of undisguised admiration. When he finally came downstairs and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, he folded his hands and looked at her with great seriousness. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "your husband was not a hobbyist." Eleanor felt her eyes sting. "I know," she said. "What he built up, there is a significant body of American studio craft work. The technical level is exceptional. The documentation is extraordinary. The rocking chair alone, in the right auction setting with the right catalog presentation, could achieve between $80,000 and $95,000. The collection as a whole, sold properly through a reputable house, could realistically reach $1.2 to $1.4 million. Eleanor set her coffee cup down carefully. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I want to help you sell this correctly," he said. "For Raymond. I know what this room cost him. My mother told me he worked on it for as long as she can remember. He deserves for it to do exactly what he built it to do." Eleanor nodded slowly, not trusting her voice entirely. Then she said, simply, "Tell me what to do next." The sale took 11 days. Marcus moved quickly and with purpose, reaching out to 3 established auction houses and 2 private museum collections within 48 hours of his visit. By Tuesday, he had preliminary interest from a gallery in Nashville and serious acquisition inquiries from the American Craft Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. By Thursday, he had arranged for a formal viewing with the museum's acquisitions director, a measured and precise woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, who arrived at the Clover Ridge farmhouse on a gray December morning and spent 6 hours in the room upstairs without once checking her phone. Eleanor had made tea and waited downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her mug, listening to the occasional soft footstep from the floor above. She had spent the previous evening in the room herself, sitting in the rocking chair and reading 2 more of the birthday letters Raymond had left folded in the wooden box. He had written her one for each of the next 12 years, quiet voices carrying forward through time the way only written words can. The letter for her 67th birthday said simply, "I hope by now the room has done its work. I hope you are not just surviving. I hope you are living, Eleanor." loudly and without apology. "You are always too careful with your own happiness. Stop being so careful." She had read that line 4 times and then sat for a long while in the silence of the room with Raymond's tools on the workbench and his 42 years of finished work surrounding her on every side, and she had felt, for the first time since October of the year before, something that was not grief or fear or exhaustion, but something quieter and steadier and very much like peace. When Dr. Patricia Huang came back downstairs, she sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and spoke without preamble. She said the collection was one of the most significant bodies of American studio furniture work she had personally encountered outside of a museum setting. She said the rocking chair was genuinely extraordinary, a piece that would anchor any exhibition it appeared in. She said Raymond's documentation was so complete and so carefully maintained over so many decades that it would form the backbone of a dedicated gallery presentation unlike anything the museum had assembled before. She said the marquetry table was the finest example of pictorial wood inlay she had seen produced outside of a professional studio context. And then she looked at Eleanor directly and named a number: $1.35 million for the full collection, to be housed permanently in a dedicated wing of the American Craft Museum's main building, under a title that Dr. Huang said her board had already approved pending Eleanor's agreement. Quiet Work, the Raymond Voss collection. Eleanor asked for 24 hours to consider it. She spent those hours in the room, sitting in the rocking chair, thinking about Raymond at 24 years old in a rented room in Nashville, teaching himself joinery from library books. Thinking about every Saturday morning and Tuesday evening he had spent in this room while she went about her life one floor below, not knowing. Thinking about the year he had come downstairs at midnight and found her at the kitchen table crying over a stack of bills and had sat beside her and held her hand and said, "We're going to be all right, Eleanor, I promise you." And she had believed him because she always believed him, and he had been telling the truth in a way she hadn't understood until now. She called Marcus the following morning and said yes. The paperwork took a week. Marcus handled the details with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and understood what was at stake. Eleanor signed what needed to be signed, answered the questions that needed answering, and on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of December, the transaction was complete. The collection would be transported to Louisville in the new year. The exhibition was scheduled to open the following spring. Eleanor had been asked to attend the opening and to speak. She had said yes to both without hesitation. 2 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday in January, Eleanor walked into Clover Ridge Savings and Trust carrying a cashier's check for $163,000. She had dressed carefully that morning, not out of vanity, but out of intention. She wore the navy coat she had bought for Raymond's funeral and had not worn since, and she had her hair pinned back the way she wore it when she meant business, which was something Raymond had always said about her. "I know when Eleanor means business because she pins her hair back and gets very quiet," and she was very quiet as she walked through the door of the bank and crossed the lobby to the front desk and asked to see Craig Whitmore. He came out from his office with his usual measured smile, and she watched him read the check she placed on the counter in front of him. She watched the smile do complicated things. She watched him look up at her and then back down at the check, and then up again with an expression she could not entirely categorize, but that contained, she was fairly certain, a significant quantity of recalculation. "This pays off the full outstanding balance on the property," Eleanor said calmly. "I assume you will be canceling the foreclosure proceedings by end of business today." "Of course," Whitmore said, recovering his composure with impressive speed. "Mrs. Voss, I'm very glad this worked out for you." Eleanor looked at him for a measured moment. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you brought a collector to my home without my knowledge or my consent and allowed him to offer me a fraction of the true value of my husband's life's work. I want you to know that I documented that visit and every conversation between us since Raymond passed. If you ever attempt something like that with another widow in this county, I will make sure every relevant authority is aware of it in considerable detail." She picked up her copy of the check, folded it, and placed it in her coat pocket. Then she walked out of Clover Ridge Savings and Trust into the sharp January air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her face tipped slightly upward, breathing. The farm was saved. The debt was entirely gone. Raymond's collection was on its way to Louisville, where it would be seen and preserved and understood for exactly what it was. The foreclosure that had been 30 days away was canceled. The silver sedan would not be pulling into her driveway again. She stood there on that sidewalk and said, very quietly, into the cold air, "I told you we'd be all right, Ray." Then she got in her truck and drove home. What remained after taxes, legal fees, and the full debt repayment was more money than Eleanor had ever expected to hold in her name. She sat with the reality of that for several days before she did anything practical with it, because she wanted to make sure she understood it correctly. Not just the number, but the nature of it. This was not a windfall. This was not luck. This was 42 years of Raymond's deliberate, patient, deeply loving labor converted into the security he had always promised her. It deserved to be used with the same intention with which it had been built. She made her list on the kitchen table one evening in late January, under the good lamp, with a fresh cup of coffee at her elbow. The first item was debt relief for other families. She had read about a fund established by a widow in Iowa, a story that had reached her through a neighbor who had seen it somewhere online, and the model had stayed with her. She adapted it for Clover Ridge County and the surrounding region, establishing a small nonprofit she called the Raymond Fund, designed to assist rural families facing foreclosure or overwhelming medical debt. Its first 3 allocations went to farm families in the county who were in circumstances not entirely unlike the one Eleanor had stood in 2 months prior. She attended each of the 3 meetings personally and brought coffee cake to every one of them. Raymond would have approved of this. She was certain of it. She was not immediately good at it. Her first bowl collapsed on the wheel twice before she got it to hold its shape, and when she finally did produce a finished piece, it was lopsided in a way that made her instructor, a cheerful woman in her 40s named Bev, say encouragingly that it had real character. Eleanor had laughed out loud, the first full, unguarded laugh she had produced in over a year, and it felt so unfamiliar in her own chest that she had laughed again at that. She went back every Thursday. By March, her work had improved enough that Bev suggested she consider showing a few pieces at the Art Center's spring exhibition. Eleanor said she would think about it, which was the thing she always said when she meant yes but wasn't quite ready to say it yet. Raymond had always known this about her and had always waited patiently for the yes to arrive on its own schedule. She missed that particular patience of his with a sharpness that surprised her sometimes, arriving without warning in the middle of an ordinary moment. A Thursday evening at the Pottery Wheel, a Sunday morning on the porch with her coffee, a quiet Tuesday when the light came through the kitchen windows exactly the way it used to when he was sitting across from her. Grief, Eleanor had come to understand, did not go away. It changed shape. It became less like drowning and more like weather, present sometimes without warning, but no longer capable of taking the ground from under her feet. Because the ground was solid now. Raymond had made it solid. And she carried that knowledge with her the way she carried his letters, carefully and close, as the most important thing she owned. On the wall of her studio, she hung a single photograph. Raymond standing in the doorway of his room upstairs, gray-haired and smiling, caught in a moment she hadn't known was being recorded, looking directly at the camera with those quiet gray eyes. She did not know when it had been taken or who had taken it. She had found it tucked inside the back cover of one of his documentation binders and had understood immediately that it belonged on this wall, in this room, watching over the work she was only now beginning. Beneath the photograph, she placed a small card written in her own handwriting. "You worked in silence for 42 years, so I could live loudly. I intend to." The spring exhibition at the Art Center opened on a Saturday in April. Eleanor showed 4 pieces. One of them sold before noon to a woman from Nashville who said it reminded her of something her grandmother used to keep on the windowsill. Eleanor stood in the corner of the gallery holding a small glass of sparkling cider and felt something so complete and so uncomplicated that it took her a moment to identify it correctly. She was happy, not in spite of losing Raymond, not in the fragile, provisional way she had been happy in the months before he got sick, but in the full, grounded, entirely unhurried way of someone who has been given back their life by someone who loved them enough to spend 4 decades quietly making sure they would have it. Outside, Clover Ridge was beginning its slow green arrival into spring. The farm stretched beyond the windows of the art center, the fields just starting to show color, the oak tree in the yard throwing its first new shadow of the year across the porch Raymond had rebuilt twice with his own hands. The weather vane that hadn't spun freely in 15 years had been fixed by Marcus on his last visit, a small practical kindness that Eleanor had cried about for reasons she hadn't fully explained and that Marcus, to his credit, had not asked her to. Eleanor Voss had stood at the edge of losing everything and found instead that love had been building her a future all along. Behind a locked door she had never opened. In a room she had passed every day of her married life without knowing what it held. In 42 years of quiet Tuesday evenings and early Saturday mornings, and a man who measured twice and said very little and loved her in the largest and most patient way she had ever known. She set down her cider glass. She went home. She sat at the pottery wheel in her studio under the photograph of Raymond with his quiet gray eyes, and she picked up her tools, and she got to work. That is what real love does. It does not ask to be noticed. It does not need to be thanked. It works in the background, steadily and without complaint, building something solid for the person it belongs to, for as long as it takes, through every difficulty and every doubt and every ordinary Tuesday that passes without ceremony. It locks the door. It keeps the secret. It trusts that when the time comes, the key will find the hand it was made for. And then it says, simply and completely, I've got you. Even now, even still, even after everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.